Thank you so much, John. It's certainly an honor to be here and also a bit scary to face so many wild Irish people in the morning. I have not been here before, but I had a lot of expectations before I traveled here from what I've seen on the movies as regards the pride of this population, its stubborn way of living your lives, and your firm belief in the cultural connections and roots you have in Ireland. Certainly very impressive. And probably you ask why you guys would need someone sounding like the crazy chef of the Muppet Show coming here and talking about sustainability. And after, I'm even more puzzled when I see all the phenomenal stuff going on in Dublin. I guess it's some kind of courtesy to an idea I had 20 years ago when the Natural Step was founded, namely to not come up with some ideas of what sustainability meant, but coming up with the idea of discovering that together with many people in a learning dialogue. And I think that's really a brilliant idea. And I really came up with that idea. So the idea was to hang out with the smartest people I knew and then expand that circle to even smarter people across the globe, from sciences, businesses, and local governments, and then discover together how you could define sustainability and how we can define guidelines to approach sustainability, and how we can do so in a way that will improve on bottom line business at the same time. Because I had a very strong feeling, a very strong intuitive feeling, that if we only knew how to define sustainability and then learned how to gradually approach it, that would be a winning strategy also for selfish reasons. Understanding the big system better than your competitors when you are running your small system, the organization or the city or wherever it is, probably is a winning strategy. I felt that very, very strongly. And I decided to explore it together with people. And after that, this has been the most systematic approach globally, without any doubt. There is no one ahead of us when it comes to systematically explore the big picture and producing that into a generic framework. Another thing which is good about it is that it's an open-ended discussion. So each time we discover something that is wrong with it, and in science we don't vote, so it's not with one scientist discovering some kind of flaw in the framework, then it is improved. And that has happened a number of very painful times throughout the history of the TNS. The Natural Step is only one organization. It was the one that I founded and that facilitated the dialogue. But the framework is public domain. It's owned by the scientific, the decision-making community across the globe. It's published in 20 doctoral dissertations and hundreds of scientific publications. You can use it or not, depending on if you want or not. So that's the starting point here. I'm not trying to sell anything, I'm just telling you the story and hope that it will be helpful. There are 3 magic questions around this that will tell you if you're on the right track or not. And if you only ask the first of those, you will get a long story from any person with self-credibility and some pride in business. Do you have a definition of sustainability? And the answer is very often yes, and then you hear a long story that is not the definition. If you then go on asking the second question, these persons generally say, please help us. It's a magic, actually. We've tried it many, many times. And if you don't have an arrogant attitude and you move into a company with very high pride on all kinds of issues, including CSR and sustainability, and you ask all 3, they say, we're a bit embarrassed, please help us. Because if you have a long story as a response to the first question, you don't know how to respond to question number 2, and certainly not to question number 3. To be able to respond to those questions in an appropriate way, you need systems thinking, which individuals are extremely smart at, whereas groups of people are extremely stupid often, well, at least large groups. Well, not here in Dublin, but in Stockholm we have profound problems making people cohesively act as a team towards complex goals. So as soon as a goal becomes complex enough and inherently building on cooperation across sectors and across disciplines, it's extremely difficult to make big groups cohesively active together as a group. And the reason is that we very often confuse consensus at different levels in the wrong way. Consensus should never be applied at the level of detail, where individuals are creative and intelligent and should be allowed to freely act. Consensus should instead be used at exploring principles that are incontrovertible, non-negotiable, non-dependent on party politics or religious beliefs, some kind of neutral statements, just like the language. If I am supposed to act together with anyone in this room, and I say energy, and I mean the physical aspect of energy, and the person talking with me believes that I'm talking about the energy in the room, the social energy, we don't have an understanding. So it's extremely important that the language helps us elucidate what it actually is we want to do, and that that language also contains robust definitions of, for instance, sustainability, if that is what we're talking about. Otherwise, we won't get there. In complex systems, it's impossible to arrive at the goal if you don't know what that goal is. By chance, you will never win a chess game if you don't understand how to define checkmate. At least not if you're playing a very clever player. So, what the group needs to do is to agree on the trunk and the branches of interrelationships, and then allow free creativity and cultural diversity and all other beautiful things happen amongst the leaves of details. So a sustainable Dublin won't look like a sustainable Bangladesh or a sustainable Stockholm. And a sustainable IKEA will not resemble a sustainable Bank of America. But if they are sustainable, they are. Why? Because they comply with the principles of sustainability. And we must share those. If you ask individuals, not large groups in boardrooms or so, but individuals, what do you think happens to forests at the global scale? Do you think we have at last stopped losing them globally as an average, or are we still losing some forests? Most people know the answer. Even people who aggressively claim that business is war and I don't care about sustainable development, that's for others or sissies or whatever the attitude is. What about agriculture? Do you think that we at last stopped losing topsoil layers, nutrients and biodiversity in agricultural land around the world? People just shrug their heads. No, we're continuously losing it. Fisheries. What about climate change inducing gases? Are they still increasing or not? Number of people on Earth. Whatever subsystem you approach, people have a sense that it's on the decline. And the summary of this means nothing but that society at large is going deeper and deeper into a funnel of declining potential to support us and to sustain civilization. The end point of this is the republic of grass and insects, preceded by barbarism when the democratic contract collapses, because it will, when there is nothing to sustain us, when the social web, when it's over with trust between people and institutions, and when the ecosystems can no longer provide the services we need to survive, then we will not maintain a decent atmosphere like in this room. And we see this happening today in certain areas of the world, and we have seen it throughout history, on islands, for instance, where people have not been able to escape when the conditions have been too bad, like Easter Island, for instance, just mentioned one well-known example. So unsustainable development is not something new. We have seen it over and over again, and we know exactly the features. People fail to come to grips with the overriding trunk and branches of what they need to do. So they are acting in a scattered, non-cohesive way, and then they have to die together if they can't flee. But now we have nowhere to go. We are on the same spaceship, and the problem now is global, which is unique in history because of this. The worst thing, I think, is the lack of stories of meaning that connect people. The stories that tell us why it's important to be a Swede or an Irish person or whatever. The things that connect us are eroding at the global level at the time when we need it the most. On the other hand, you can turn that into an opportunity, like the city manager was talking about, to have a shared mental model about sustainability and to do it together, because it's only together we can do it. That is in itself a prime story of meaning. Just a few examples of the funnel, and I will just stick a little bit to climate change, though there is a risk doing it, because a lot of people believe that that is the sustainability issue of our time. That's far from true. The worst sustainability problem is the lack of competence in our leaders of our time to understand sustainability. That's the main problem. And the incompetence to deal with this very complex issue at the time when we really need it. One of the consequences, and we don't know scientifically if it's the worst, is climate change. But I will just dwell on it for a while because it captures so much interest. If we look at the consequences, we have seen an abrupt change during the few last years of people saying that they like to do something for sustainability, which they have kept saying in 80% since decades. But that have now changed in reality from 10 to 20, which is a doubling of the number of people on the market doing it. And this is United States numbers. It's higher in Europe. That's a huge change in the eyes of business, in particular since you can anticipate that this will go on growing, because survival issues are very convincing in the end. Another example of change is how macroeconomists have begun to listen and pay attention. They were referring to this as externalities before. Just, the world was so big that all the waste and all the problems to the big system that we generated by our current way of running the economy could be disregarded. And now we suddenly realize we can't. And if we just continue to dwell on climate change, Hurricane Katrina, the kind of weird weather most people see around them, the United Nations International Panel on Climate Change, the Stern report, Al Gore, all of it together has created a change also in economists. Here you see how, for instance, the Stern report, which is authored by someone who is not known to be an environmentalist, on the contrary, comes from the macroeconomic community, previous leader of the World Bank. Conservative numbers showing that if we mitigate emissions of fossil CO2 now, the cost would correspond to around 1% of GDP. But the outcome might be a profit of $2.5 trillion for all kinds of reasons, savings and new innovations, and those are conservative numbers. Whereas if we postpone the mitigation of CO2, the cost will correspond to around 5 to 20%, conservative numbers, of GDP, and lead to the worst global depression ever. Talk about opportunity. Another example is what happens in the political community. During the time when the White House has been reluctant to act, we have now 700 mayors signing off on Kyoto targets, just disregarding the White House, which is a typical event as well, because change generally happens in the periphery. It doesn't happen in the central establishment. And if you look at the mayors, they sometimes represent quite large cities, not only small, cute municipalities, but New York, Houston, San Francisco, Boston, and so forth. So it's quite a movement that has played a significant role in the outcome of the current presidential election that the city manager mentioned in his talk. Investors, there are growing demands from the financial community now for making it mandatory for business to have disclosures as regards how dependent they are on fossil fuels. If a company is married to the idea of fossil fuels, that it is unethical to not reveal this in their disclosures, because that investors should know, particularly investors of large money, pension funds, and so forth. Another shift that has happened is that only through a few decades, we have moved from a situation where 80% of the values of companies were to 80% attributed to what accountants look at, real estate and hardcore financial values. Whereas the brand name, the soft values, the intangibles only were 20%. And the shift has been completely abrupt. Today, 80% is attributed to intangibles as an average, which is an opportunity for those who want to improve on their brand, but it's also an extreme danger for those who are living dangerous lives. Suddenly, the value can just go away from a company very fast. In particular, if the values we attach to a brand show to be inflated, ballooning, which brings some thoughts to the current financial crisis. What is it we have evaluated during some times at a time when we need to pay attention to what human values really are all about in that funnel? So referring to the funnel back again, if you ask any individual business person who feels this intuitively, you don't need to convince even very aggressive Americans who think that business is war and who do not want to think about CSR and that kind of stuff. Even they understand deep in their hearts that this is the leading determinator of future business success. if you ask them, as we keep losing resources, what do you think resources will cost in a few years when there may be 9 billion people bidding on the remainders, not just 6? What do you think will happen to waste management costs if you are part of the problem in this funnel, generating more and more? Do you think that prices for management will go up or down? What do you think will happen to insurance if you're part of the problem? Your loans, international business agreements, such as the Protocol of Montreal or Kyoto. What will happen to markets? Do you think people will still like to have clothes and food and housing tomorrow? And do you think it's a business idea to provide those without being part of the problem? All of these questions are completely obvious. It's an insult to wait for the answer. The business community knows this perfectly well, one by one, and when they have their breakfast conversations with their daughters or contemplate their grandchildren. So what's the problem? The problem is that we are confused at the level of detail. And that in turn is because society at large and big businesses indeed are divided in division of labor into expert groups. And each expert group produces a silo for him or herself, digging deeper and deeper down in those drill holes until only the feet are sticking up of those holes. And there is no connection between all those experts at the level of their heads, which creates something which is called reductionism, believing that eventually, by understanding all the details, we will pull it all together, and nothing could be more flawed than that. We seek knowledge, but we drown in information. There's only one way, one escape route, and that's called systems thinking, which means to do what the city manager was asking for, creating a shared mental model that makes it possible for all the drill holes to connect. And then we can make use of all the tremendous knowledge which is discovered at the depth of each drill hole. So there's nothing wrong being an expert, going deeper and deeper into understanding. But it's wrong to do that instead of understanding the context within which that exploration is done. I have a beautiful example of this. My previous job was as a cancer scientist and a clinician, and I was leading the reference clinic for bone marrow transplants in Sweden, which is a very, very complex way of curing cancer. And it's always run in the format of clinical conferences. And it's very easy to understand. Now Mrs. Anderson is going to die because she has cancer, unless we cure her. And to cure Mrs. Anderson, we need the pathologist in his or her drill hole, because now we want the cellular diagnosis to be exact, not some flaky cancer issue. We want to know exactly what tumor it is. Then we need the radiologist, because we need to know the distribution of the tumor. Not some flaky stuff, but using the sharpest tools we have today. And then we need the surgeon and the radiotherapist and the pharmacologist. We need the nurse, we need the social worker, because the whole family and society at large must be mobilized behind Mrs. Anderson, otherwise she won't put up with this relatively tough treatment. Together today we cure well above 50% of those patients. And by cure, I mean they live normal long lives without any medicines and dying from something else but their cancer. So they are really cured. What's the difference? The difference is that all those groups have a very concise shared mental model of success. They envision Mrs. Anderson ahead of them in the future, and they have successfully killed the last cancer cell without killing Mrs. Anderson. And they don't have divergent points of view regarding that. So with as mild as possible methods, they are going to attack from as many angles as possible all those cells to the last cell, and sparing all her other tissues. Today, the patient is Dublin, or any other inherently unsustainable organizational unit, dying from the deadly disease unsustainability. And to cure this patient, we need business people, politicians, economists. We need all those professional groups in their drill holes. But there is no way we will succeed if we are only talking about this, or if we have all the good attitudes or all the good intentions. But if you don't have the competence, meaning we don't know how to define the endpoint, we don't know what a healthy Dublin would be as regards sustainability, we won't end up there. Then we have found ourselves another talk club. And don't believe that the smarter people you have in the room, the likelier it will be to arrive at a very concise principled definition, unless that is the focus. On the contrary, smart people very often have very, very robust ideas of their drill holes and what it is they want to defend. And most people leaving talk clubs like that say that now I am confused, but at a higher level. And it won't help us. To that end, we need a framework that gradually elaborates on Dublin in the social global system in the biosphere. That's the system. And you need to define success. And it must be robust and relatively well known amongst those decision makers who are going to make a difference. Now, and only now, you can be strategic, stepwise approaching it. And now you can foster your actions. And now you can define the tools you need. So don't think that I'm talking about the tool. I'm just talking about a completely intuitive, logical framework for succeeding in any complex endeavor. You must understand the system. You must know how to define success, if it is checkmate or whatever it is. And you must have some strategic guidelines. And you need some tools, if it's a complex endeavor, for auditing, decision help, and so forth. Now you can foster, with those tools, your actions to be strategic, to have a success in the system. And you cannot afford to be confused on those levels. In the dialogue, we have been running more systematically than any other. We have explored the system, how it works, how sustainability is feasible to even contemplate. And we have, based on that understanding, asked ourselves, why do we have a funnel? Why, by what functional routes do we destroy the system? Overriding basic functions. And there are only 4 ways of destroying it. One is to systematically allow mined materials to increase in concentration. And indeed, that's how we are designed. We never say that. Instead, we say fossil CO2 and cadmium in kidneys and phosphates in lakes. And we keep on adding problems amongst the leaves, but it's one and the same design flaw of society. We allow mined materials to increase as waste in the system. And that is inherently unsustainable. We have complete scientific consensus on this. The other is we are also conducting ourselves such that we allow chemicals to increase, combinations of elements. But we never say that. Instead, we say PCB, DDT, dieldrins, freons, phthalates, pesticides, dioxins, anti-inflammables. And we send out scientists to explore the impacts of each of those and trying to ban the ones that are toxic or whatever, while neglecting that huge amounts of chemicals are systematically increasing, each of them approaching their unknown ecotoxic threshold, which is inherently unsustainable. And we don't ask a question, what would a society be that don't violate those 2 principles? The opportunities are huge. And it's another question than asking, do we emit DDT or PCB? The third question is that we are systematically removing natural systems as well, physically. By far too large fish boats and asphalt layers and digging machines, we are gradually removing those areas that capture sunlight and provide the services that all of civilization need. It's nothing wrong to build a road on cropland, but it's certainly wrong to build more and more roads on cropland that will systematically deprive what we need for eating. And it's obvious, no people find that difficult to understand, but you can systematically and scientifically explore to what end we are encroaching on those areas. And the fourth is that we are systematically eroding the social tissue by not ensuring that people's needs are met wherever we are active, including suppliers from developing countries. Beyond those, there are no basic principles. And now we have shown that if we comply with those principles, we can ask people to become much more smarter, they become more creative, they get out-of-the-box solutions within IKEA, Seattle, Philadelphia, wherever we try it. It's phenomenal to see that we get clinical conferences and not talk clubs. Because smart people in the room can now suddenly dig up from their drill holes relevant knowledge and put it at service of principles that everybody understand and do not deny. In particular, since we also say to anyone, if you find any flaws with those principles, please tell us so that we can change them and improve them. So by just paying attention enough on that big perspective, we have arrived at those principles. And they are the same at McDonald's and Seattle and Dublin, making it possible to speak to one another. So when Dublin is sustainable in the future, it does no longer contribute to the first problem, the second, the third, and violation of the fourth principle either. That, in turn, means that we must now subdivide those principles into second and third and higher order principles, which is quite easy. Once the big picture is laid out, it has turned out to be quite easy. And to model it, and to equip this understanding with, by the way, I will see to that you will get a little picture book with this. You don't need to take notes if you don't like. I will give you the pictures and some notes taken to each picture if you like. Now you can put healthy Mrs. Anderson at the level of principal ahead of you. You don't know exactly what she will do in the future. You only know that she doesn't have the cancer, and she may then flourish in the way she likes, according to her cultural belief systems and so forth. But you know that. And those principles, to be operative, must be necessary for curing cancer or arriving at sustainability or winning in chess. There must be enough. General, so that the drill holes can speak with one another, concrete and distinct. And what I'm now talking about is the only set of principles that meet those criteria, by the simple reason that we have designed them to meet those criteria. So it's not that we are better than other frameworks or that we have succeeded at a higher level. We have just explored the big picture more systematically than anyone else. Because that's what we've done. It doesn't mean that that's more important than any of the drill holes, but they provide the connection between the drill holes. And now we can move to strategic guidelines, meaning that we can, A, share this understanding and have a language for it so that we can talk, avoiding the talk club result. We can analyze today's situation from a point of winning, just like a chess player. How are we doing with reference to the principles of checkmate or sustainability? That's B. C, what possible solutions are looming in the horizon that are theoretically possible within the constraints of those principles? And creating a long list of possibilities for Dublin or any of your companies. And D, how do we prioritize amongst those possibilities in a way that will stepwise move us from where we are today to our visions that are sustainable? And this brings in the strategic dimension. This is why companies doing this have good luck all the time, and the ones don't doing it have bad luck. You ask, is that moving us away from the walls of that funnel towards the principles? Will it be possible to further it in that same direction so that it's not a blind alley? For instance, marrying Dublin to the idea of natural gas, which will bring you a bit closer to not emitting so much CO2. But if you get married to it, you have inherently married yourself to something that violates the first principle and has no future. Doesn't mean to say that you can't use natural gas, but you must be aware that it is not a final solution. So you must put that in the economical, strategic context. And I've seen this happening over and over again in organizations understanding this, and I've seen well-intended, extremely smart organizations do real blunders, investing themselves in a stepwise fashion right into the walls of the funnel with all the good intentions. And the third question is that you must ensure a good return on investment so that the money influx will ensure future progress. And that brings us to actions. We have now tested this in the business community. IKEA was the first big company turning to us for help. They were extremely attacked, and they had indeed been confronted with the walls of the funnel. They were attacked by Greenpeace as one of the major targets. They were known to emit certain toxins that people were talking about. And instead of getting rid of it, they eradicated it from their catalog and tried to hide it, which made Greenpeace and journalists even more interested in IKEA, until they eventually turned to us for help. And what we did was we educated 600 teachers, educating 60,000 employees in the early days. And then they created a whole family game of the ABCD methodology and invited employees to come with smart solutions, smart early stepping stones that would carry IKEA forward. And they shared this between all the employees, leading to completely new chemicals, new set of elements. They eradicated lead and all the elements that are today violating the first principle. Stepwise moved away from fossil. They stepwise improved logistics, have one train of their own traveling through Europe every day. Really, really convincing stuff. And suddenly the whole headquarter in southern Sweden was covered with photovoltaics, which cost a fortune. It was the biggest plantation of photovoltaics we had in Sweden at the time, and they were completely silent about it. They didn't boast, they didn't talk about it, they just did it. And people ask, why? I mean, it's only one of the buildings and so forth. Yeah, but we educate all the teachers about the funnel and the ABCD and the stepwise approach here. And we assure you, when people come from Hong Kong, leading IKEA in Hong Kong, going to be educated about sustainability, and they find the whole head office covered with photovoltaics, it gives them a vague feeling that top management probably mean what they're saying, you know. Then we have seen a number of other, IKEA for instance, threw out PVC because they only got defense responses from people running plastic companies. Other materials are worse than PVC. And we're much better now than we did before. And we are trying to recycle the PVC more, from 18% to 21% now and so forth. And IKEA kept asking, but we don't have PVC the way you make it in the future. What is your plan? And since they didn't respond, or couldn't respond, they phased it out. And then Scandic Hotels did the same. And then Nike did the same. And eventually Hydropolymers, which is the major producer in this part of the world, turned to us in anger and said, what are those principles? And what's happening here? You know, what are you doing to our business? And instead of defending, we run a workshop explaining the principles. And that led to that Hydropolymers became the by far most proactive plastic company in the world, bringing in the whole supply chain. Roman Haas was one of them, and I think they are the most proactive company in the whole world now. So they are working throughout the whole supply chain to meet those criteria, those principles, and it's spreading faster in the chemical sector than anywhere else I'm aware of. Anyhow, we have shown that this is truly generic. It can be applied anywhere, but each time we have applied it, the framework has improved somewhat, because unlike experts like myself, CEOs and top managements are experts in running complex organizations in the complex world. Experts are amateurs on doing that. So what does that mean? It means that top management must run the sustainability agenda, asking people like myself and green managers advice. But if they are patting green managers on their shoulders and coaching them and saying, well done, but they don't run the agenda, it won't work. This is an inherently strategic agenda. And if they don't understand the framework, they don't ask the right questions. This is a saying from the founder of Interface, which is the world's biggest manufacturer of flooring. As we climb this mountain, the sustainability mountain, with those system conditions at the top, we're doing better than ever on bottom line business. And he can talk extensively about the walls of the funnel and how it feels being confronted with those walls. And he says that they do it not at the cost of social or ecological system, but at the cost of competitors who still haven't got it. They still believe that they need to lobby for loser legislation and loser political measures, paying for that, instead of being aggressively proactive towards future markets and doing it in a stepwise fashion. This is CEO of Volvo, who said this publicly in Sweden a few months ago. He was leading Electrolux when he first employed the NATO Step framework. And he said that it was only 10 years later, when the walls of the funnel had strangled even more that market, they understood how many billions they have saved from doing this stepwise before legislation forced them to do it. So they were the first to phase out CFCs. They were the first to switch systematically away from copper to aluminum, because aluminum cannot possibly increase in concentration in natural systems because of balances that you can show people with indicators, whereas copper already is. And furthermore, the reserves are shrinking. So by applying the framework and the lens, they gradually moved towards sustainable practices, whereas competitors had bad luck a lot of time, until they eventually picked up what Electrolux did and then followed. Then they also built community, not only within Electrolux, like I just talked about IKEA, but also with policy legislators. So once they realized that cadmium has no future, they began to learn how to produce lithium batteries, which were a bit more expensive. But they produced them and turned to a niche of the market that were prepared to buy for it. And then they turned to legislators and said, what about a little higher tax on cadmium batteries? And they said, do you want a high tax on what you're selling? Yeah, but we have other stuff too. And legislators listened, and that extra tax came, and then they were up and running business-wise. Same happened in OK Petroleum, applying this framework, by which they developed the cleanest gasoline on the world's market, Optima, new Optima, and alcohols as a new brand of fuels way back in time, 15 years ago. And once they had them up and running, they made a deal with us that in each city we could sell 5 alcohol-driven cars, they would put up a pump. And after 2 years of work together with the NATO Step, the Swedish map looked like it had acne, you know. Now it has the measles. We have those pumps all over the city, all over the country, and you can drive wherever you like because of this. How did that start? How did they do it? Again, they did the same. Once they had developed the new stuff, they turned to legislators and said, what about a little high tax on fossil fuels? What? Yeah, well, we have other stuff too. And the competition is the same, and they scored. So Sweden was first to implement an extra green tax on CO2. And that in itself was enough, it sufficed, to switch the whole heating sector in Sweden away from fossil to renewables, by use of some other smart inventions that followed in that dialogue with the private businesses. For instance, district heating and stuff. I can talk very long about that. Another thing here, which is very important to point out, is that there are a few other things, but avoiding the walls of the funnel, that makes the framework attractive to business. One is that once you understand how to define sustainability, well, once you turn it from a talk thing to something which is robust, you can calculate the resource potential for the future. And then you get happy again. The resource potential to live civilized lives within those constraints is huge. There are a few things we can't do at all, because then we just violate the principles right off. But as long as we stay away from that, the recyclability of natural systems, carbon flows, water flows, CO2 flows, is huge. The biodiversity is enormous. So in a stepwise fashion, there won't be any obstacles to improving life quality in Ireland and in Sweden and in the United States and across the globe within those constraints. But we can certainly not do it with the technologies that are mainstream today. So it needs innovation, but we have most of those technologies up and running. We only need to scale them up. And we need to do it in a smart, stepwise way, in dialogues between people who know what they are talking about and not just babbling. Another is that if you know how to define where you want to be, you can deal with trade-offs. Today, people are choosing between plague or cholera all the time, choosing between evils. Is that better than it is better, or is it better than it is better? And scientists love those kinds of questions, and they immediately divide into two groups, one saying that it is better and the other saying that it is better. And then you have top managers or presidents of nations who already know what they want. They like nuclear power, for instance, because they've always liked nuclear power and think that it is a sort of symbol of progress. So they can find themselves a scientist that verifies that. And then you have politicians going in the other direction. And none of those, neither the scientist, nor the politician, nor the president talking about this, know how to define sustainability, nor have assessed nuclear power in that context from a strategic point of view, because they don't have the tools. So it's another very dangerous talk club evolving from that. Another is that most CEOs running this framework has notified the most advantaged part of it all is that it is community building. It's simply a phenomenal asset when you want to build community and teams to have a shared mental model of what it's all about and where you're heading. People respond in a phenomenal way. Sick leave go down, productivity goes up, and so forth. And finally, it's very helpful if you have out the constraints of your goal to integrate that into your own visions and thereby run your management systems. It's much cheaper and smarter, and we certainly help organizations with that as well. And this is how it's done. You don't live our lives to avoid cancer. We don't live our lives to avoid unsustainability. We live our lives to meet with aspirations and visions, and we put them ahead of us. Those are our intrinsic internal visions, core values of organizations, and strategic goals. And then we learn how to inform all of those by the sustainability principles. And how do we know if that integration has been successful or not? Two things. Number one, the business case is made clear from the vision. If you have a company doing that, and why this will be competitive and why this will be a winner financially is also made explicit from that point, then it's a winner. And number two, they haul it out of the bookshelf each time they're going to evaluate a big investment. So they don't only use it when the big boss is going to talk beautifully once every year at the annual meeting. Then it won't help. But when those two are met, you really use it, and the business case, the financial rationale for doing it, is made clear from that goal, then it works. And then they use that backcast from the full picture of the goal. This saying comes from that president of perhaps the most proactive company in the whole world. It's called Roman Haas. It's a chemical giant in the United States. And he recently claimed that it is that integration that will completely determine who will be the winner and who will be the loser for tomorrow, to do that integration. And they have certainly done it in a beautiful way in their company. This is a review of 100 companies reviewed by a very well-known business advisor in North America. He divides companies into, the first one are criminals. They don't even comply with law and legislation. Quite a number of those, though not many in prison still. Then compliance means that they're at least not breaking the law. Third are beyond compliance. A growing breed of companies have learned eco-efficiency and save resources in relation to sales. And they are already conservatively calculated 38% more profitable than the others in his review. And then you have that fully integrated breed of organizations. There are very few there. IKEA is there, Interface is there, I believe Patagonia is there, Nike is getting there. There are a few on the way, but it's like a drop in the ocean still. Most are at the eco-efficiency stage, heading for full integration. As John said initially, we've done this for agriculture, forestry, energy, employed scientists to study also sectors in this way. And since businesses can do it, and since sectors can do it, using the same framework, they can create their B list of challenges, C list of solutions, D list of early smart steps, compare notes, and suddenly work together across sectors. And consequently, this way of thinking is growing faster than anywhere else at the local government level. It began in Sweden in one cute municipality far north of the polar circle, spread south. Today we have an association of 70 governments in Sweden doing it. And then it spread to Canada, United States, American Planning Association. And I have put Portland in bold text to not forget to mention that there is a little DVD about Portland and the business community there. And it's a fascinating story. The business community in Portland have been working with those principles for years and started to do businesses across the framework, across value chains, and then turned to policy legislators and politicians and the mayor and convinced the whole city to endorse the framework. So this time it didn't come from politicians to businesses. It's vice versa in Portland. That guy is mayor of Whistler in Canada, and he recently won the United Nations Award for leading the most proactive local government in the whole world. They had been working with different programs and different tools since years. And it went well in the early days, but the longer they went, the more they realized that we don't have cohesion. We don't understand how those tools relate. And furthermore, the business community is reluctant. They're not on board. They think that this is all about demands, all about costs. They don't sense that this is investments. So then they just took everything they'd done and made it cohesive by use of the framework. And suddenly business stepped on board, Chamber of Commerce was on board, and then they have, together with business, created the Vision 2020 statement and eventually are so far ahead of the game that they won this award. And I think righteously so. He's traveling around the world, and I think he would be happy to go to Dublin because it's quite a challenge to bring on a big city of this kind from Europe as well. Finally, just a few words about tools. There are so many tools around that people have begun to be confused. Only for the tools. So I was invited by UNEP, since we have defined the big picture and defined it scientifically, to lead a work by which we were going to explore how all those tools relate. ISO 14001 is not an alternative to what I'm talking about. That's an administrative vehicle to put in the stuff that follows from using the framework. Ecological footprints is not an alternative. That's a way of disclosures. If you apply the framework, develop your plan, move ahead, your footprint will decrease. And the footprinting concept is a way of disclosing that to the general public in a very sensual, tangible way. It's a beautiful way of disclosures. But it is not an alternative to bringing out the big picture and moving ahead strategically. Factor 10, I won't dwell on, just say that we published it in United Nations public journal for sustainable development, and it was the most downloaded article ever in the history of the journal because people are longing for comprehension. So we simply applied the framework to explain what those tools were good for and what they did not do, and we did it together with all the pioneers behind the tools, which was also a political achievement, of course, because each pioneer of a tool loves his or her tool more than all other tools. Finally, this. We scored on 9 May, which was the major event in my professional life. We then managed to have 5 Swedish agencies mobilizing financial resources for a 10-year scientific program, whereby the core element of what I've been talking about now, the 5-level model and how it works in reality, equipping it with ever more refined tools, will be further refined during a 10-year period in a systematic approach. Linked to that, we have petals, the blue petals of the flower, which are universities across the globe who are exploring their stuff by use of the same 5-level framework, bringing their own money to do so. So the total value is already $15 million after only a few months, because people want to attach to this flower. And it would be made me extremely proud if we could have Dublin University merging forces with us and put a petal up on that flower. And it's an open-ended scientific approach. We just own it together. Just a few examples. That's business exploration. That one is about mineral flows and metals in society at large. This is about tools for regional planning and case studies. It's 2 people leading that one. Industrial ecology is to scrutinize that so that you see the risks of industrial ecology as it is currently taught, and that you see the power of it as well. It's from Finland. This is how to grow algae mass by using algae biomass culturing, producing fossil fuels. No, sorry, producing biofuels at the same time as you can improve on soil. It's in Macquarie University of Australia. This is healthcare, Toronto. Water management around the River Rhine to avoid flooded systems there is run by the University of Nijmegen. This is monitoring of the Amazona rainforests by use of satellites using the same framework. So you can see how widely applicable it is by scientists, all of them doing exactly what they would like to do, but phrasing it by the same structure so that we can have that clinical conference also from a scientific point of view. And this also means that if you would be interested in moving ahead and taking your university into one of those petals and starting to make your visions a little bit more robust and cohesive, then it would be easier to share that knowledge with others, helping others, and also to have an influx of knowledge from them. That would be the consequence of it. So, thank you very much. I will just, the very final slide is just to explain that we also have recently presented to a Swedish funding agency a process model for how to implement this way of thinking in governments and in business. And what we have done is that we have observed the most successful governments. And the way they do it is that they create a vision which is robust, a goal that is robust to the far left. They are also allowing the general public to see how they are now begun to creating a vision, to get input from the general public. Then experts from different sectors are running that model through an ABCD analysis. And the outcome of that is presented to the decisive elements of business and local governments, to the strategic structures, policymakers and politicians and elected officials and so forth, non-elected officials, NGOs and so forth. And the feedback from that goes back to both the vision to shape that even better, and of course to the experts in learning loops. And this has been done in different modes in different municipalities, but those components are there all the time. So these are my conclusions. Sustainability is truly more about competence than values. You can dislike other people. You can be a nerd who like to be only with yourself and your own company, trying to make more money. You don't care about nature either. And you can still learn how to do this to be more profitable and have a safer future. So you don't need to do it out of values. You can do it out of understanding. It's the largest competitive edge ever. There is no long-term trend that has been stronger than this one. Even if we would be on Titanic Even if we wouldn't make it in the end, first class on that ride would be, until the bitter end, to be relatively the others less part of the problem, because your costs will be lower and your profits will be higher until the end. Backcasting from principles is the only way to capitalize on this, which also was talked about by city manager. If you want to succeed, you must have full integration of sustainability into your own visions, so that the integration is made in a tight way, so that it's not loose-ended or left to value systems and controversy, because then you have the talk club again. There is already a growing network of case studies, and we already have a growing number of tools that are aligned with this, and there is an international action research program that we own together. There is no affiliations, you can step on board or not. It's an open-ended learning endeavor. And I am extremely excited to learn about Dublin's next move. I hope that you will. And help us to learn by sharing your experiences with us. Thank you very much.